Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Tuesday, July 12th. I'm Julie Stautland filling in for Nima Rajan. The Conference Board of Canada is cutting its estimate for economic growth for this year and next year as central banks around the world hike interest rates in an effort to deal with soaring inflation. In its new two-year outlook, the think tank says it is not expecting an economic contraction in Canada, but the risks are creeping up. The Conference Board says it now expects Canadian economic growth will average 3.5% this year, followed by 2.6% next year. That's down from its earlier projections for growth of 4% in 2022 and 3.3% in 2023. A new poll suggests most Canadians believe the country is in a recession and that prices will continue to rise for the foreseeable future. The wide-ranging Leger survey asked Canadians and Americans about issues such as travel plans, airport delays, and inflation. More than 80% of Canadian respondents said they believe prices will keep going up, and 59% said they think Canada is in a recession. The outlook was similarly bleak south of the border. BC Premier John Horgan says he and his counterparts from across the country are discussing ideas for fighting inflation and the rising cost of living at the Council of the Federation's summer meeting in Victoria. Mr. Horgan says that while some of the causes are global, such as the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the impacts are local and require sustained intervention. Yesterday's talks ended with provincial and territorial leaders calling on the federal government to boost its share of healthcare funding from 22% to 35%. Canada's industry minister has announced a slew of demands for telecommunications companies intended to improve the industry following Friday's widespread Rogers outage. François-Philippe Champagne has given telecom companies 60 days to reach agreements on emergency roaming, assisting each other during outages, and a communication protocol to better inform Canadians and authorities during emergencies. The minister says the outage was unacceptable, and his announcement represents just a first step. A tentative deal has been struck between Via Rail and the union, representing 2,400 of its workers. It means a strike has been averted at Canada's national passenger rail service, and trains will keep moving on schedule. Details of the new contracts have not been released, but Unifor says they will be once members have ratified them. Via Rail says the tentative agreements give traveling Canadians a break from the uncertainty of a possible shutdown. Air Canada and Emirates say they have signed a strategic partnership agreement and plan to establish a code-share relationship later this year. The airlines say the deal will create more options for customers when traveling on their networks. They say the code-share deal will offer improved choices for Air Canada customers traveling to the United Arab Emirates and to destinations beyond Dubai. Emirates customers will see an improved travel experience when traveling to Toronto and other key destinations where Air Canada flies. A spokesman for Patrick Brown says his supporters believe that if their candidate is not reinstated, then Jean Charest is the best alternative. Chisholm Pothier says Mr. Brown spoke to supporters on a call yesterday evening, and he spoke very highly of the former Quebec Premier. Mr. Brown was disqualified from the contest last week by party members on a committee overseeing the leadership race. He is fighting for an appeal. A 33-year-old suspect is now charged with first-degree murder in relation to an incident last month where a woman was set on fire on a transit bus in Toronto. Police have upgraded the charges against Tenzin Norbu following the woman's death. Investigators say 28-year-old Nima Doma had no relationship with the alleged attacker. They say she suffered life-threatening injuries and was rushed to hospital but died on July 5th. Irving Oil says it's expanding hydrogen capacity at its refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, in a bid to lower carbon emissions and offer clean energy to customers. The company says it has a deal with a New York-based company to purchase a 5-megawatt hydrogen electrolyzer. It says the apparatus will create 2 tons of hydrogen a day using electricity from the local grid. That's enough to fuel 60 buses with hydrogen. The Continental Cup curling tournament has been cancelled for a third straight season as Curling Canada continues to revamp its competition schedule for the 2022 to 2023 campaign. We'll be right back. A Canadian small business group is calling on the federal and provincial governments to temporarily eliminate or lower fuel taxes. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business says record gas prices, supply chains, entanglements, and labor shortages have pushed the cost of doing business through the roof. It says higher transportation and fuel costs have driven 92% of small businesses to increase prices in the past year. For more on this, along with other requests to governments amid the Council of the Federation's summer meeting, we are joined by CFIB's Vice President of National Affairs, Jasmin Guenette. Mr. Guenette, thank you for being back with us on Forum Daily.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The CFIB is asking governments for fuel tax relief. Why is this important to your members?
Right now, fuel and energy are the top concern for small business owner. It's the major cost constraints that all small businesses are facing, and why we are asking the federal government and provincial governments to reduce a fuel tax to help small businesses deal with the increased cost of doing business, especially regarding fuel and energy costs.
Besides fuel, what are some other requests you hope governments consider for your members?
Yes. Well, first is to find solution to help small businesses deal with the increased cost of doing business. So, for example, reducing payroll taxes, reducing the carbon tax, lowering the small business tax rate. All this to help businesses deal with inflation costs. Put in place policies to find a solution and ease the current shortages of labor. As you know, all businesses in all sectors across the country are having difficulties hiring employees, and so shortages of labor is quite an important issue right now. And we're asking also for COVID-related debt relief. With 2 years of lockdowns, many small businesses are facing a huge amount in COVID-related debt.
In a recent press release, you are asking for governments to address internal trade barriers. What is the cost of these barriers to the economy?
Yeah, good question. A few years ago, the CFIB and other organizations estimated the cost of interprovincial barriers at around $14 billion. So that's a huge number. It represents time and money for a business owner to comply with different rules, sometimes conflicting rules from one province to another, from one province to a territory. And so it's quite expensive for small businesses, and it's quite costly for the entire economy.
The economy has continued to emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the major concerns for your members as the recovery continues?
Well, as I mentioned, the increased cost of doing business, every single budget line of a small business is increasing. And so there's got to be policies helping small businesses to deal with that. As I mentioned, shortages of labor. We see signs out there almost on every storefront. So shortages of labor, cost of doing business, supply chain disruption is another major issue facing small businesses. As I mentioned as well, COVID-related debt. And so as we move out of the pandemic, I think the policies that are put in place should be helping businesses to cope with the current inflation that we are all facing.
Thank you so much for your time today on Forum Daily.
My pleasure.
Up next, a look at news from around Canada and the world. Hundreds of electric vehicle charging stations are promised for Saskatchewan and Manitoba. More details emerge about the 2020 Nova Scotia mass shooter, and NASA releases striking images from the James Webb Space Telescope. We will have more on these along with other news from around Canada and the world after the break. So stay tuned to Forum Daily. We'll be right back. A new poll suggests flight cancellations, delays, and long lineups have 53% of Canadian respondents concerned about airport travel. Half of Canadians who responded to the Leger poll said they were not concerned about the passport delays. And just 18% said travel issues are causing them to significantly change their travel plans. People from the prairies were more likely to believe the pandemic rules are the problem, and those from Atlantic Canada and Quebec were more likely to blame airports. Up to 400 new electric vehicle chargers are being promised for Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The federal government is spending $2.5 million to support the installation of chargers in public places, workplaces, at apartment buildings, and other areas. The announcement is part of a national plan to encourage people to switch to electric vehicles. Newly released documents show the Nova Scotia man who killed 22 people in April of 2020 was long known to be violent, especially among people who owed him money. In a summary of evidence released Tuesday, the inquiry investigating the mass shooting shared new details about Gabriel Wortman, who ran a denture-making business. They include witness testimony about Mr. Wortman's practice, providing discount work for poor people, and then attacking those who didn't pay their bills on time. Other witnesses have described him as creepy, possessive, and quick-tempered sexual predator. A Canadian-born professor is preaching the merits of using risk management to prevent mass shootings in the U.S., a country with about 400 million guns. Computer science professor Dr. Sheldon Jacobson says screening potential gun owners could be done using the same thinking used to pre-screen air travelers. Dr. Jacobson, who moved from Montreal in 1983, helped to develop TSA PreCheck. The pre-clearance system is designed to identify low-risk air travelers and has been used in airports across the U.S. for more than a decade. The committee investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol is set to highlight the way far-right extremists answered what one lawmaker describes as Donald Trump's siren call to come to Washington. The panel convened Tuesday for a public hearing into what it calls the final phase of Mr. Trump's multi-pronged effort to halt Joe Biden's victory. The committee says Mr. Trump tweeted the rally invitation at a pivotal moment as dozens of lawsuits and false claims of voter fraud fizzled. It says the far-right Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and others now facing criminal charges readily answered the call. Latvia's president says he supports a plan to reinstate national conscription for men and for women on a voluntary basis. The draft could be reintroduced next year after a hiatus of over 15 years. The president, who is the supreme military commander of Latvia, a NATO member that borders Russia, said in an interview with Latvian broadcaster TV3 that he favors the idea, floated by the Baltic countries' defense minister last week, to create an 11-month mandatory military service for men aged 18 to 27 from the beginning of 2023. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has announced temporary taxes on banks and energy companies and promised a series of measures to help people suffering from soaring inflation and utility costs as Russia's war in Ukraine drags on. The taxes on the banks, natural gas, electricity, and petroleum companies are expected to bring in 7 billion euros over 2 years. Speaking Tuesday, in an opening address to State of the Nation parliamentary debate, Mr. Sanchez said he was fully aware that people are having a hard time economically. Along with the corporate taxes, he announced discounts for urban mass transit services and free commuter rail passes between September and December. The European Central Bank says its president, Christine Lagarde, was targeted in an attempted cyber attack, but no information was compromised. The Frankfurt-based central bank said Tuesday in an emailed response to a query about a report by Business Insider that the attempt took place recently. The bank added that it was identified and halted quickly, but that it had nothing more to say amid an investigation. NASA is releasing new photos from its James Webb Space Telescope that offer a glimpse into dying stars and distant galaxies. The United States agency released 4 new images today during an event broadcast worldwide, one day after the White House released the first image from the telescope. We'll be right back. Iran is not denying an American report that says it plans to provide drones to Russia. The U.S. warned yesterday that it believes Moscow is turning to Tehran for hundreds of drones for use in its invasion of Ukraine. A spokesman for Iran's foreign minister says the country's technological cooperation with Russia dates to before the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin announced today that President Vladimir Putin will visit Tehran next week. The Pentagon says it has killed a leader of the Islamic State group in a drone strike in Syria. U.S. Central Command says Maher Agal was killed and an unidentified senior official in the terror organization was seriously injured. The Pentagon says there were no civilian casualties, though it is not possible to immediately confirm that. The U.S. carried out the strike outside a town in the northwest Syria close to the Turkish border. The UN Security Council has approved a resolution extending humanitarian aid deliveries to 4.1 million people in Syria's rebel-held northwest for just 6 months. It's a victory for Russia, which vetoed a resolution for a year-long extension on Friday. Ireland and Norway circulated a new draft yesterday that provided for a 6-month extension. Anything past that would require a new Security Council resolution, as Russia demanded. European Union nations have approved fresh aid for Ukraine as the country faces growing economic damage from Russia's invasion. Finance ministers from the 27-nation EU gave the go-ahead on Tuesday to 1 billion euros in loans to the Ukrainian government. The sum brings the total amount of EU macro-financial assistance to Kyiv this year to 2.2 billion euros. An initial 1.2 billion euro EU loan package got the green light from the bloc finance chiefs days before Russia's full-scale February 24 attack. Sri Lanka's lawmakers have agreed to elect a new president next week, but they are struggling to decide on the makeup of a new government to lift the bankrupt country out of economic and political collapse. Facing severe shortages of food, fuel, and medicine, protesters on Saturday stormed the president's home, his seaside office, and the official residence of his prime minister. Both officials said they would concede to demands that they resign. The promised resignations brought no end to the crisis. Lawmakers agreed to elect a new president from their ranks, but they continue to struggle to decide who will take over as prime minister. London's Heathrow Airport is capping daily passenger numbers for the summer. And it is telling airlines to stop selling tickets as it steps up efforts to quell travel chaos caused by soaring travel demand and staff shortages. The UK's busiest airport said Tuesday that it's setting a limit of 100,000 passengers that it can handle each day through its September 11th. The restriction is likely to result in more canceled flights, even after airlines already slashed thousands of flights from their summer schedules. Japan is bidding farewell to Shinzo Abe. The former prime minister was gunned down at a campaign rally last week. Hundreds of people gathered outside a Tokyo temple today as a private funeral was held inside. Crowds later lined the streets of the capital to pay their respects as a motorcade with a hearse carrying his body and accompanied by his widow slowly drove by. Four-time Olympic champion Sir Mo Farah says he was illegally brought to the UK as a young boy. In a new documentary, Sir Mo says he was forced to care for other children before he escaped a life of servitude through running. He says his real name is Hussein Abdi Kahin and that he was taken from East African nation Djibouti. The BBC reports the athlete said he was 8 or 9 years old when a woman he didn't know brought him to the UK using fake travel documents. Hundreds of couples whose weddings were derailed or scaled back due to the COVID-19 pandemic got a do-over thanks to a New York City landmark. The Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts hosted Celebrate Love, a re-wedding on Sunday in the pavilion outside the center. Lincoln Center's website called it a special day for newlyweds, those whose weddings were canceled or diminished, and people who want to recommit their love to their partners and the city we love. I'm Julie Stautland filling in for Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for today.